Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
We've arrived at episode number 4 of our 4-part series on optimizing men's health, products and services you may not know about, but need to. And in the final installment today, we are talking about Kava. Now, Kava is a legal plant medicine that has been drunk, I don't know if I say drunk or drank, but I'm going to go with drunk, for centuries by the people in the Pacific Islands, places like Fiji, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, to enjoy states of relaxed, calm, clear-mindedness. Many islanders will drink Kava in place of coffee or alcohol. Kava is starting to gain recognition here in the States for elevating mood, enhancing the quality of sleep, and also increasingly used as an alternative to alcohol in social settings. Kava's biggest claim to fame, however, is it reduces anxiety. And for someone like me who runs anxious, that's appealing. Kava's also been known to enhance mental focus and creativity. Now, I've been using Kava since December of 2021 before bed to enhance my deep sleep. And you'll hear me talk about in a couple minutes the tangible and significant effect it has had on increasing the amount of deep sleep I've had. But as you'll hear today, not all Kava is created equal. There's a lot of crap Kava that's out there, raising safety concerns, and you need to know how to avoid the crap and hone in on the good stuff. It's kind of similar in some respects to coffee. Sanka ain't the same thing as bulletproof, right? One is really jittery and tastes like crap. The other is clean and has been cleared of all the toxins. So to help us sift through all of the weeds of Kava, I brought on Cameron George, who's the founder of True Kava, and their products have met the rigorous standards of the World Health Organization, which has allowed them to classify their Kava as a food safe for daily use. And I've been using one of their products, Kavaplex, since December to help enhance the quality of my sleep. So in this episode, you're going to hear about what Kava is it safe, and who should and shouldn't use it, the ways in which you may want to use Kava and its benefits. Cameron will talk about his personal journey of being a very sick kid and also ending up in a place where he was addicted to Adderall and anti-anxiety medications that nearly ruined his life, and how he got off of them using Kava. And the links to any of the Kava products that we talk about today will be in the show notes, and I'll remind you of that at the end of the episode. So enjoy the final installment of our 4-part series on men's health, products and services you may not know about, but need to. The conversation today on Kava. Cameron, brother, I've been looking forward to having you on the show, man. Back in December, for the first time, I stumbled upon a plant medicine named Kava because I'm obsessive about my sleep. I got the Oura Ring, I got the blue light blocking glasses, I have the blackout shades, I've got a chili pad, I do all the things. I've been constantly looking for a way to increase my deep sleep, which is that ultra restorative stage. You flush out all the toxins, your muscles repair. And I'd found myself at a bit of a plateau until I found your product, Kavaplex, which I took a little dropper of every evening for the past 3 or 4 months. And I was able to increase my deep sleep from 1 hour and 45 minutes a night to about 25 more minutes per night, which blew my mind because all the other things that I'd done up to that point had only made an incremental impact. So I'm now over 2 hours of deep sleep a night regularly. And I just wanted to know, how does this stuff work? And I had a chance to listen to you on Ben Greenfield's podcast, on Dave Asprey's podcast. So welcome to the Great Man Within show. I would just love to know from you, man, what is this thing called Kava, and what are its uses, and why are you so passionate about it?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Kava is probably one of the most exciting up-and-coming plant medicine compounds that's sort of on the forefront of what I'm kind of calling this plant renaissance that we're kind of in the middle of right now, where we're starting to see not only a new emergence, but also a reemergence of a whole litany of different medicinal plant compounds that have both been used for thousands of years historically. Most of them have. And then even some new ones, derivatives and things of old ones that are sort of surfacing. But basically, modern culture, especially in the Western world, has sort of, finally turned the lens back to nature in a time of kind of like desperation, where a lot of our synthetic pharmaceutical compounds and our sort of ripoffs of nature have brought us to this point because of their whole litany of side effects and deleterious effects long term, where we're taking a second look at pharmacology from nature and compounds that, because they are from nature and do come from the same natural ecology that human beings spring out of. Human beings are an extension of the natural ecology. There's a cross systems compatibility between the two living systems of plants, fungi, and humans with certain species, right? If a relationship can be formed, just like with humans, certain relationships can be formed and we're compatible because we came out of the same intelligence that was shaped by sort of from the Gaian principle, nature, right? So, because of this reemergence, there's a whole litany of these different plant compounds, and we're seeing some of the really strong psychoactive ones like ayahuasca and DMT and psilocybin, and then even derivatives like LSD and things like that, as far as on the psychopharmacological side of things, and even a reemergence of some of the tonic herbs that have been used forever in traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda, like, the ginseng class or the reishi mushroom class or the chaga class, more like, physiological compounds that aren't psychoactive. But across the board, people are reinterested in plants. And we're even starting to refurbish our love for even compounds like coffee with, phenomenon like bulletproof coffee in the last few years, clean coffee, and people actually caring about where their coffee comes from and adding mushrooms into coffee. And so we're starting to realize that a reintegration is needed with nature and natural pharmacology, because we've developed so many different degrees of separation from it. Every step that we've taken away from it into the world of synthetic chemistry and better living through synthetic chemistry, we start to see more and more chronic disease. So for that reason, there's this whole litany of compounds, and Kava is one that hasn't gotten a lot of press, but Kava is actually, in my view, one of the most important and has the most wide versatile potential as far as its broad spectrum of use and the number of people that can benefit from it. I do believe that Kava can eventually and will eventually become as common as a cup of coffee in the Western world, because it's one of those medicines that's psychoactive like coffee, but not too psychoactive like psychedelics, and that carries with it a broad spectrum of effects that are so relevant today. So that brings us to what the heck is this Kava thing? It's a drink, just like coffee is a drink mixture that's prepared from the beans of Coffea arabica, right? That's prepared in a specific way with natural non-solvent extraction, non-chemical extraction, water, heat, pressure. You pull the compounds out of these beans and boom, you get this thing called coffee, right? That's basically what Kava is. Kava is not a part of this plant. It's the mixture. It's the natural mixture prepared naturally that has the full spectrum of living constituents in it that's not denatured, of the roots of this shrub-like plant that grows exclusively in islands in the South Pacific. And that's called the Kava plant. It's called Piper methysticum is the scientific name, which literally means intoxicating pepper, because it has this sort of elating, sort of euphoric feeling that's not non-depletatory and that doesn't, compromise your faculties and everything. So it's really this amazing set of effects. So what does Kava do whenever it's prepared in this form? Unlike coffee, that's very stimulating and kind of puts you into that beta state, high productivity, but some compromise in your creativity, introspective thinking. Kava really gives you a really balanced state of mind, right? So it brings about a state of calm, relaxed focus. So mood, relaxation, and mental clarity are sort of the trifecta of categories that it works on. The effects are a little bit in high dosages, or even a little bit like alcohol, but without the drunkenness, without the impairment, without the addiction. So it's like, well, then it's not like alcohol. A lot of people say, well, that's what alcohol is.
Isn't that the point? Yeah.
because if you were to take away those things, you would be left with a type of social lubrication, a relaxation, a desire to connect and engage with other people, but without the sort of muddling up of the brain chemistry, the suppression of your higher consciousness, the addiction, and sort of the inhibition and all of that stuff that can lead you to, illicit behavior that you wouldn't normally elicit.
Yeah. One of the things I've heard you say that I think is really powerful that made that sense of that for me is you said that like coffee, Kava doesn't take you off your center, but alcohol can, right? You can become a totally different person when you've had too much to drink. But coffee, yeah, you may get a little bit hyper, but it doesn't take you necessarily off your center. I know Kava has a very different kind of energizing effect, but I think that distinction was really helpful for me to make sense of what you're saying.
Very, very much. I mean, we always say that it elicits calm, relaxed focus. So it doesn't sedate you. Well, it can if you use certain strains, but most of the time with balanced strains like we use, it has effects on dopamine, it has effects on GABA and serotonin kind of all together. So it kind of brings you into an alpha state. So it's a calm, very engaged, socially enhanced, but yet almost mentally activated state as well. So activated, but not stimulated, if that makes sense. Activated, but relaxed. It's always the perfect state for learning, processing information, maximum creativity, and productivity at the same time. So really, it's a calm, enhanced state of natural sobriety. You don't go into this altered state. It really feels like an enhanced you. But at the same time, you do get this like euphoria. A lot of people don't like that word euphoria because most compounds that we have available to us, euphoria is associated with danger, at least being a vice of some kind, right? A guilt around it, because usually euphoria accompanies potential addiction, potential negative behavior, potential drunkenness, and all these things that can be okay if you keep within a certain range, but can be dangerous, right? But Kava is one of the compounds that comes from nature because of that system compatibility that I talked about, because it's natural. It comes from the natural ecology. It doesn't throw off the system and it doesn't contradict or undermine the intelligence of the system. It works with it in a really unique way. And so it gives an effect that most people have never experienced. They've never experienced relaxed euphoria that kind of feels like alcohol, but without the drunkenness. You feel more of like yourself, right? So like, in the islands, instead of regular bars, they've got 20 times as many Kava bars.
Which islands are you talking about?
Right. So islands in the South Pacific, the main home of Kava, or the island chain that produces most of the world's Kava, is an island chain called Vanuatu. It's a few miles off the coast of Fiji. So everyone knows Fiji, and Fiji is number 2. So Fiji and Vanuatu actually export most of the world's Kava, but then there are other island chains, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, well, and even Hawaii. But, Hawaii doesn't have as much. We're kind of working to change that, but it's definitely is present in Hawaii, and actually used to have more before the Americans came in and brought alcohol. That's another story. But it does grow in Hawaii, and there are Hawaiian Kava strains, but it's kind of funny. A lot of people have been to Hawaii a million times and never heard of Kava because it's still kind of in pockets and indigenous people there. So yeah, it's a very, very different experience, but it's its own experience. That sort of sober euphoria, or that sort of, sober psychoactive thing that's non-addictive, is not only incredibly rare, but it's extraordinarily valuable because, Kava is actually most famous, not just as a physiological medicine. So it's probably most famous for reducing anxiety. Out of all the receptors that Kava hits in the brain, it binds most strongly to what's this subset of receptors in the brain called the GABA A receptors. The GABA A receptors, or the A subtype of the GABA receptors, is a pathway that, controls the inhibition of excitation in the body. So it's the calming system in the body. So GABA is the neurotransmitter that opposes glutamate, which is the most excitatory or revving up of the neurotransmitters that is very important. But if it gets out of balance, it can lead to anxiety and seizures, and it can damage the system. Excitotoxicity is what they call it. So GABA is basically the calming chemical that anything that you can imagine that acts as a sedative, either exogenously or endogenously, involves the GABA pathway, either directly or indirectly, right? So GABA is what relaxes you, that helps move you towards being put to sleep. GABA is what sort of calms and shuts down the system, opens you up, brings down the anxiety, opposes cortisol, adrenaline. So basically alcohol hits GABA pretty hard, but alcohol hits it in a different way. And also the other class of compounds that hits it really strongly and directly are the benzodiazepine class of anti-anxiety medications, which are an incredible double-edged sword. They can be useful in an acute traumatic event, but if you use them chronically, they're some of the most dangerous substances a person can, just because they're extremely addictive. So if you use them consistently, like day after day, if you get on them regularly, any psychiatrist that's, today that really knows anything, that is on the up and up at all, is hesitant to, prescribe these things for daily use, because the withdrawals from benzodiazepines can be lethal. They're so bad that the habituation, we hear a lot about the opiate epidemic, but there's a benzodiazepine epidemic that's almost just as big, just hasn't really hit the press in the same way yet, because people don't overdose quite as much from benzodiazepines, but they die from the withdrawals. Because when coming off of benzos, your body, just like any drug, your body, depletes that chemical, because that's how drugs work, right? The difference between pharmaceutical drugs and alcohol and compounds like Kava, we talked about that biological compatibility and the reason that intelligence of the plant that's a living organism that doesn't throw off the body systems and cause it to sort of ricochet and say, hey, this is a foreign thing, and it sort of throw off the entire assembly line of biochemical processes in the body. Pharmaceutical drug does that. It intervenes and basically hacks. It hits one receptor, and it basically just to get a short-term release of a certain chemical or pathway. Problem is that it doesn't let all the other pathways know to help to replete that chemical, right? To keep it going, to keep all the checks and balances on it like a plant medicine would, right? Because a plant medicine has many compounds that work at every step of the assembly line. I use that metaphor like an assembly line because that's basically what it is. It's like one biochemical process leads to the next, then it ends up in your symptoms, all the way from producing energy to making, these chemicals that make you feel good, and then over into your symptoms. And it's like if you intervene here at the second to last one, it doesn't tell the body to recorrect itself down at the first few steps. Big problem, because then eventually you throw off the entire assembly line and the whole thing is going crazy. Just like if you were to go into a factory and change one thing at one person's step on the assembly line, then everyone gets confused and stuff runs out, so it's a big problem. And that's how pharmaceutical drugs work. Because of that, basically what you're doing with pharmaceutical drugs or alcohol with say this GABA pathway, for example, the relaxing pathway, alcohol, benzos, you're borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today. It's really that simple. Because of that assembly line effect, you're going in and you're sort of like charging credit. It's like you don't have enough chemistry right now to deal with your stress. So you're like, I'm going to go get a loan for some more, or I'll charge it. Let's just charge it. Just get the credit card. The problem is you have to pay it back with interest, because the next day you're more depleted than you were before, because now you've just used up your stores. So you were depleted before, you're feeling bad. You borrow from tomorrow, you get a loan. Oh crap, tomorrow I'm in debt twice as much. I'm even more anxious. So the need for the next benzo is really created and accentuated by the last one, just like cigarettes, right? You can say this about any addictive drug. So the difference between pharmaceutical drugs like benzodiazepines that create that effect. See, eventually with benzos, you run out of your bank account of this stored GABA, basically. And GABA protects your system from basically going into complete chaos. And whenever it depletes itself, your body ricochets in the wrong direction because you've depleted your bank account. You have nothing left. So all of a sudden, your pre-existing anxiety, there's nothing to keep it in check. It just goes crazy. And your excitatory systems can go so crazy that it can throw you into epileptic seizures, heart attacks, strokes. And so some people die from benzodiazepine withdrawal, and many people don't, of course, but you feel like you're dying, right? It's a horrific experience if you were to say, go cold turkey off these things. So that's kind of the difference between anti-anxiety drugs like benzos and like alcohol versus a compound like Kava that actually has that biological compatibility that's very, very different in the way that it works. So that's Kava's main claim to fame, is its ability to reduce anxiety while not only not depleting those systems, but we can talk about this further. It actually has a reverse tolerance effect. It actually helps to replete those systems. We've shown in the studies that it helps to increase GABA receptor density and the amount of available GABA. So it's great for coming off of those drugs.
Cool. That's really helpful, Cameron. And I think, just to do even a checkpoint here is what I'm hearing for the uses of Kava, right? So the person who's listening that may be on anti-anxiety medications or has anxiety, someone that could benefit from using Kava, someone who's knows what it's like to be in a high beta brainwave frequency state by using a lot of caffeine and, feeling I can get really creative on caffeine. But at the same time, there's those alpha brain waves, those beautiful alpha brain waves I know Dave Asprey talks a lot about. And I went to his 40 years of Zen, got the brain mapped and did all the brain training to get alpha waves, which is that much more, like you said, kind of you're awake and alive, you're activated, but you're not overstimulated. So you can have that like natural ease of energy. And also, finding that Kava has excellent applications for, relaxing before bed for deeper sleep. So these seem to be like some of the big ones. Are there any other uses that you've been finding, because obviously you talk to a lot of different people who are using Kava in your products in a lot of different ways. Are there other ways that you see people bringing Kava into their daily life?
Yeah, 100%. Plant medicines, because of that broad spectrum complexity, unlike a pharmaceutical drug, the reason why it has that assembly line distorting effect is because pharmaceutical drugs are single molecules that are usually isolated or kind of rip-offs of nature. We go in, we kind of steal individual molecules to get one specific effect. That's why drugs have one effect, and it drives this assembly line chaos, which is why you have one effect you want and then many side effects you don't want. With plant compounds, especially ones that are tonic like Kava, they have a whole litany of active constituents that work together. Like each active constituent is like an individual instrument in a musical orchestra that play beautifully together. And whenever you put them all together, they create this symphony of harmony. You're just like in the human body. We don't have just one hormone doing one thing. We have a symphony of hormones, of neurotransmitters, of cells, of supportive cells, of cytokines, all this stuff that's working together. And plants work the same way. So whenever you try to like do this weird hack thing with these synthetic single molecules, it confuses the whole system, right? Because these intelligences are meant to work together. Because that's the case, because there's so much complexity, plant compounds don't just have one single effect, right? One linear effect like a drug does. We see this today emerging with CBD, right? It's like becomes almost, cliche and unbelievable to some people how one thing can be purported to do so many things. And sometimes it does get overblown or over accentuated, but plant compounds, because they work on the base of the body, they can normally bring the entire body towards health across a number of different metrics, depending on the plant compound. So because that's the case, compounds like Kava, although its strongest application definitely is that sort of anxiety reduction, relaxation component. It has a litany of different biological effects that are incredibly therapeutic across the board. And I always go to the scientific literature first because that's where I started with this thing. And Kava is one of the most well-studied herbs in the world with a broad array body of scientific literature available on it. So outside of cannabis and ginseng and a few of these others, it's very well studied. What Kava's main sort of signature is across the board, or the common thread or the common denominator of what it is as far as its essence from like a living organism standpoint, and also in the scientific literature, this is reflected as well too. Kava is a protective substance. That's why you see the reduction in anxiety and all these different things, the neuro and tissue protective mechanisms, the anti-inflammatory mechanisms, and a few other things, is because it plays a protective role in the natural ecology, which is a whole nother story. It helps to create an adaptation through chemistry of biologically compatible protective compounds that help to protect other plants against pests and a few other different things. So, by doing that, whenever you take that plant, you transfer it to your body, it transfers that sort of protective biochemical array, to you. And so because of that, it has all these protective mechanisms. The main one, of course, we talked about the GABA pathway, which reduces stress hormones, which is protective to the body. It's also a sodium and calcium channel blocker, which is the same mechanism a lot of anti-seizure drugs work with. So that blocks the overexcitation of the cell that leads to free radical production and inflammation. So it works as an anti-inflammatory, but also helps to calm the cell from getting too excited, basically. It acts as a COX-2 inhibitor as well. COX-2 inhibitor is the same mechanism that non-steroidal anti-inflammatories work on, but while those drugs are very hard on your stomach lining and on your kidneys, ibuprofen and things like that, Kava has that mechanism as an anti-inflammatory as well, another protective mechanism. It also, through hormesis, it hits on some of these antioxidant production pathways. So it stimulates the production of catalase, glutathione peroxidase, superoxide dismutase. These are all protective compounds that, from an adaptation standpoint, it stimulates your body's production of, upregulates them. And then it also has effects on dopamine without depleting it, which is huge because most things that affect dopamine are addictive because they release it. It's a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and it's kind of complicated how it works, but similar to how it works on GABA, it helps to raise dopamine levels in the brain, prop it up naturally without using it up, like say like an amphetamine like Adderall would or something. Adderall is going to dump it, and then your brain's shot the next day when you take amphetamines or something. So all of those things put together, what do all those things mean, or how does that play out in the actual effects? Okay. Because of all of those things, because it affects GABA, dopamine, serotonin, and acetylcholine, because it affects all these inflammatory and inhibitory pathways, and it hits on a lot of these metabolic pathways too. It's an AMPK activator. That's adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase pathway. Basically, that's a fat burning pathway. Also, it's a cellular autophagy inducing pathway. Those of us that are kind of in this world, is this thing about getting rid of zombie cells, senescent cells, precancerous cells, and just bad cells. It's a way of anti-aging a person, or slowing the aging process, but also protecting ourselves against cells that can go rogue, cancerous cells and things like that. So basically what all of those mechanisms mean is that Kava is great on the anxiety reduction standpoint. It's great on the mood boosting side of things. It's great on the nootropic side of things. Like I said, it has this mind protective optimization thing. So it activates the brain while protecting it from damage from free radicals and things like that too, from the anti-inflammatory, anti-seizure stuff. So in traumatic brain injury, we see great results with people getting on Kava because it calms down the storm, the cytokine storm that happens after, and that can persist for years or decades. By calming that down, it allows the brain to heal more effectively. That happens with all kinds of brain injuries as well, too. So this neuroprotective compound is great for any post-brain injury type of scenario.
This may be a great point to actually get into your story of how you came to Kava, because I know that it was a long path and you went through some really tough times as a kid, then also as an adult, and you had some brain scans and some images that, doctors looked at and said, man, I don't know how you're not suicidal. I don't know what's going on in your brain. And maybe you can share a bit of your story about how you got here and how Kava has specifically worked for you.
For me, I got horrifically sick in my early 20s. My life completely unraveled in just a notoriously horrific set of unimaginable circumstances. It was just a complete disaster. I was going along one day. I was a high functioning kid. I was a collegiate athlete. I was a distance runner, competed, professionally marathons and stuff like that. So I was high functioning, working multiple jobs. And, the wheels started to fall off. I started to get a litany of different symptoms, just thought I was overtraining. So I backed off. Things didn't get any better. They kept getting worse. I ended up in a psychiatrist's office. They prescribed Adderall and a litany of other different psychotropic medications, which took an already depleted, what I know now was a metabolically depleted toxic system, and just blew it up, right? The bottom fell out because you take a system that's highly vulnerable. You're already borrowing energy by living off of caffeine and sugar and these things because you're doing a bunch of different things environmentally wrong, food-wise, environment-wise, even emotionally, psychologically wise, and you're broken. And you don't approach it at its base, at the roots. You try to approach it, downstream in the symptoms with synthetic drugs. This is what taught me about the difference between synthetic drugs and natural compounds. When you do that and you play that credit game, you end up going so far in debt that in my case, the bottom fell out to a point in which nearly killed me. I got on these amphetamines, and I'm like the worst personality type as far as my wiring to be put on amphetamines. Because again, the model of psychiatry, it doesn't do blood tests. It doesn't do brain scans like Daniel Amen or any of these people that are actually good, psychiatrists. Standard psychiatry just looks at your symptoms and then gives you a corresponding medication that can derail and change the entire course of your life based on just like clinical observation and symptoms. And that's like throwing darts at a dartboard blind. That's a horrifying thing to do in most cases. And you're not even looking at cause first. You're not even looking at lifestyle. You're just like giving a powerful synthetic amphetamine drug. Amphetamines, meth, it's just packaged with a different mechanism in a pill form. I already had sort of a high strung, what the Chinese would call a yang personality that teetered to the hyper impulsive side, to this sort of high energy, sort of burns hot type of side. You throw amphetamines in a system like that, that's already burned out, that's already over accentuated, you put them into a psychosis pretty quick. It's essentially what happened to me. I was just sick, and then I turned into sick in a full blown psychosis where I went into, basically I started living the life of a meth addict, but in months, and lost all my jobs and stopped all the stuff that I was doing.
Were you taking other drugs? Were you taking like non-pharmaceutical drugs on top of that?
It ended up there, but that was already after it was completely derailed. It was Adderall mainly. Amphetamines was like, there's a couple other antidepressants that were in there and some benzodiazepines and things like that. But Adderall was the thing that was like really drove me into this craziness to where like I was living basically a normal life and got sick. Didn't know that I was sick, just knew I was having problems. Then I ended up living the life of like a meth addict within like 3 or 4 months after being prescribed this drug. I did everything from I went on crazy buying sprees, and actually physically, I was charging credit to my brain, but actually reflected that in my life. I charged like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of credit. I was always, savvy, resourceful, I guess, on finding ways to make money legally. I was doing things, and I was working in an electronics store at the time. I was like flipping TVs and reselling them on Craigslist. So I was making enough money as a young kid at 21 to where I could fund some really bad habits then. So it just like fueled this insanity. I ended up going and buying like a whole litany of exotic animals for my like 700 square foot apartment. I had monkeys and dogs and piranhas and a fish tank. I had crazy stuff. It was a trifecta cross between Ace Ventura, turned into Breaking Bad, and then where I was sourcing these animals, a little bit of Tiger King in there as well too.
Okay.
It's kind of funny because when that documentary came out, I was like, I've been to those places. I bought animals there, So I was like a collegiate athlete, was around certain types of people. This changed my mind state, ended up around a litany of horrifically toxic people, drug addicts, the whole thing. Things just got super dark. It's amazing how this drug brought me just like into this alternate reality where I'm like around a bunch of drug addicts. People are going to jail. People are dying. I wake up in the morning. I'm having the parties and the people and the stuff and that. The animals swinging from the light fixtures, the whole thing. I wake up, there's a drug addict sleeping on my floor I've never met before, eating pizza. I'm just trying to paint a little, give you a few little nuggets for this.
I can see it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You can see it's like Jesse Pinkman's apartment.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was picturing, but minus the monkeys.
Yes, exactly. Throw that in there. So it's just insanity. So that's where that mentality, I say that because it's funny now because it's over, right? And, because of where things ended up, and there's great things that came out of it, the learning experience. And thank God I survived it. A lot of people don't, but it was my mentality that, that took me there. It was my perspective. It was my paradigm. It was, giving up responsibility of my health to a third party and saying, fix me. And then taking this sort of drug for my symptoms that was a totally disempowering process. And I ended up where I ended up. So then my health was completely destroyed. I ended up basically horrifically sick with an autoimmune spectrum illness where I started having crazy reactions I became so toxic, basically neurotoxic. I ended up with these, what's more common today, less common back then, autoimmune conditions where I started reacting horrifically to everything in my environment, developed all these crazy food allergies. I'd eat a bite of food and go into a seizure, got to where I couldn't eat anything virtually, was basically wasting away, was dying. I was so neurotoxic and liver toxic. My gut was destroyed and ended up traveling around everywhere, trying, medical tourism, exhausting the allopathic model, realized that was not going into the functional medicine model, got into the whole biohacking world eventually and stuff like that. Over years, got my life back. And in the process came across Cava because I was having 10 seizures a day and I was on these heavy doses of benzos and they were losing their effectiveness. Remember charging the credit, losing the bank account. Now they're not doing anything for me. And if I go off them, I'll probably die because the seizures are already lethal with them or they're close to it. And I couldn't eat food because the seizures, I would have seizures when I eat food, And so I was in the middle of this process, needed to find some exit strategy. And what I was looking for, because this was like several years down the line. I spent a good 6, 7, 8 years of this descent into illness and where I was almost near death after the Adderall and the monkeys and all that stuff. And during that time, all distractions were taken away from me. I didn't have a life anymore. Like fun, didn't exist. What's that? I didn't have relationships or friendships or anything. Thank God I had a support system with my family. I was able to move back in with my parents. They're basically taking care of me full time. All I had was a computer in front of me and a really, really determined and motivated mind that I just spent every waking hour of every day scouring medical and scientific literature and trying to find answers to piece together not only what had happened, but change my paradigm and piece together a way out. Reached out to doctors, researchers, scientists, all kinds of things, read scientific literature, just this whole thing that a lot of people getting into this world have to do. I had to do it on my own and then collaborated with great people, ended up getting into this world and meeting a lot of influencers, different things. But during the process, that whole thing, I needed to find a way off of the benzos because I was at a critical juncture. I was looking at compounds that could help act as sort of like an analog or a replacement that wouldn't be as addictive, that could interrupt that process. Didn't know if I was going to find it. Of course, tried the whole medical cannabis thing and a million strains of those and didn't work. It just didn't diffuse that pathway, made my anxiety worse. I didn't respond well to THC at all. CBD
I've had the same problems.
Yeah. CBD was too weak. THC was too psychoactive and was just like, oh no, it's too sensitive. And I had developed a litany of different contacts at this point because I just was talking to everybody. I had this relationship with this guy who was an indigenous islander from the South Pacific. And I had talked to him when I was at my critical juncture. And he's like, dude, have you tried Kava? This is the obvious choice. This is the part of our culture here. It's the main thing. I'm like, yeah, I've tried Kava, but I was thinking the Kava capsules that are available in some health food stores in the United States, because you can find those. And it's called Kava. It's not the same thing. By definition, it's not the same thing.
I think the analogy you gave was the Kava capsules are kind of like if you took a caffeine pill and tried to pass it off as a bulletproof coffee.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Except for it's not even a perfect analogy because at least caffeine pill gives you effects, but a lot of side effects. Gives you all, the jitters, but you feel it a lot. The Kava capsules actually take away 80-90% of even the potency, right?
Okay.
So at least with the caffeine pill, you get a really imbalanced, muddy experience. It's not smooth like drinking coffee is. It can give you jitters, heart palpitations, but at least there's that strong effect that's there with caffeine powder. You lose the effects, but it's no more like Kava. Kava isn't than caffeine is coffee, or like cocaine is coca tea, right? those people who've been to Peru and coca tea is like a medicine. Cocaine is not, right?
Yep. So you were down on Kava because of what you had heard, the Kava pills. But so this islander introduced you to the real deal.
I was like, I've tried it. He's like, well, what'd you try? And I told him, and he just laughed. No, dude, that's not, no. He's like, that's not Kava at all. And I was like, oh, great. Okay. So please, can you get some for me? It's like, yeah, of course. Because he knew, several farmers and stuff, and got me some really strong, fresh Kava, which is like the strongest way to have it. He had froze it and sent it to me overseas, like as fast as possible. So I get this stuff, and it's like this fresh, frozen bag of semi-ground root that looks nasty. And he taught me how to prepare it, sent me a couple of videos that they had taken of indigenous islanders preparing it. I had to get this strainer bag and knead it into this bowl of like hot water, for like 45 minutes. It was hell to do. I had to actually have my family help me do it because I was so messed up at the time. It was like hard for me to like do this all the time. It's a long process. And then you end up with what looks like a bowl of mud.
Tasty.
Which I was perfectly happy to drink. I was like, hey,
if it works. Yeah.
And so I'm like chugging this mud. I was blown away by the effects almost instantly. Especially after a couple of days, I started to notice that it worked the first time, but then after using it for a week, 2 weeks, I was getting this crescendoing effect that all people know about with Kava. There's this break-in period that we talked about earlier with the reverse tolerance. So the least you'll ever feel it is the first time you take it, even though, most people do feel it, the first time.
I want to double click on that because we talked about this before we started hitting the recording. The reverse tolerance that you talk about is that break-in period, the first week or so, like you feel it a little bit. But over the course of time, it actually gets stronger, which is the opposite of like, some of these other drugs you use where the first time is the best time and then it depletes.
Because of the repleting effect, the opposite. That's why in the scientific literature, it's starting to be not only not seen as a drug, but it's known as an anti-drug because it helps to rehabilitate and take your chemistry in the other direction, take it on the upswing and help those receptors recover instead of pulling from them and using up, exhausting them, which is what all these drugs do, which is why you need more of the same substance to get the same effect whenever you do that. And it just depletes, it steals from your system. Kava gives back. So because of that, first time you take it will be the weakest it'll ever be. And there's a buildup period and then it'll eventually level off. Then you never have to build up again after, using it for about 2 months. It stays there. Even if you take time off Kava, it may go down a little bit. That break-in period is mainly the first time you start integrating Kava in your system. Really, really unique how that works. We're not even exactly sure how that works, but we just know it's the case. So I always tell people to take kind of the 30-day Kava challenge, like give it some time to get where it's going to get. And then you can alternate strains and things like that if you're using different strains, if you're getting into the weeds with it. But, so basically I started using this stuff and 2 weeks into this, I'm like completely blown away. I hope to get something out of it, right? I really didn't think that it would give me anywhere near what a benzo would, but it did. It gave me everything and more because it didn't muddle up my thinking like the benzo did. It didn't make me feel out of it and messed up, sedated. All of a sudden, I just felt like I could cope with stress easier. It lifted my mood. My cognitive function was horrible at the time. I wasn't eating and I was inflamed and the whole thing. And it allowed me to focus. It got me motivated. There's the dopamine aspect to it. It was like dropping 2, 50-pound weights I was carrying on my back.
Huge. Yeah.
And so that's what we've noticed a lot is that, anyone with any chronic condition, it's worth a try because it just helps you actually engage. Because a lot of times people with chronic condition are so overwhelmed by the stress and trauma of it that they're frozen. You can't do anything because you're just like so frozen. You don't have the motivation. You don't have the hormones. So basically within 4 weeks, my seizure activity had reduced by about 85%.
Wow, that's amazing. Life-changing.
In 2 months, I was off of daily use of these benzos. I was completely off, which, from a medical detox standpoint, if you've ever worked in this field or seen it, it takes usually a year and a half minimum to taper off of benzos that you've been on for years like I was. And even then, a lot of people aren't successful because their receptors are so messed up. And so they're the hardest drugs to get off of, really hands down. It takes a slow titration taper. In 2 months, to be able to get off these things, I was completely blown away. So I just dove into it from there. The doctors that I was working with, the functional medicine doctors that I'd gotten into this network with, they had started hiring me on the research and product development side. I started, creating some of these Kava preparations and integrating them into their protocols for people who are getting off of these drugs and things like that. And so we started working with that and just getting hundreds of feedback, clinical observation experiences and things. Not to mention, I'd spent all this time, I'd read every piece of scientific literature that's available on Kava. I delved into it and started, collaborating and talking to some of the primary scientists who had worked on Kava in the US, Europe, abroad, the whole thing, in the islands, went and got integrated into the cultures in the South Pacific, got to know the indigenous people very well, the people that are there, people in the Kava industry. So I started to develop this framework because I knew that I wanted to do something with this. I got to know the regulatory framework, the history, the literature, the whole thing intimately. So I knew how we could usher this in, because I was like, how is this not in the market already? And it's kind of the same thing between like marijuana and CBD. People just didn't make these distinctions. They're actually denatured forms of kava that aren't good for you. And so there's this lumped in association, and just people just didn't know about it because it hadn't been, even that form hadn't been super reported on, because just like many of these other plant compounds, it's like psilocybin's finally making it into medical use in like one state in the United States and making it into studies and stuff, marijuana, even ketamine and compounds like that. So, so basically it wasn't present in the marketplace. I got involved in this. It took me years of building this framework of how do we ethically and how do we responsibly integrate this, both from a scientific standpoint, being totally in line with the scientific community, with the regulatory agencies, with the medical community, and with the general public, because there's a marketing aspect to this too. So I had to build this entire machine, and then we were able to launch True Kava finally, which is more than a kava company. It's an advocacy campaign, an educational campaign for introducing kava as a food into the marketplace, because in the islands, it's consumed as a food. It's their number one export in Vanuatu and in Fiji. It's drank for weddings, funerals, spiritual ceremonies, social gatherings. It's used for everything. It's like we use coffee here. And so it deserves to have that food classification and it to be available for people, not only as an alternative to dangerous substances, but just as something that can improve people's lives without the dangerous side effects of all these other things,
Yeah. Cameron, I think that's a perfect place then to kind of transition towards, someone who's been listening now who's like, okay, I got to go try this stuff now. You have a number of products that you offer at True Kava. I told you at the beginning that I've been using Kava Plex before sleep, but what are the products that you offer? How would you encourage people to use them, and how are you seeing people use them?
Okay, so we've got a lot of R&D in the pipeline, and eventually we're going to spread it out into a lot of different forms of edible kava. But right now, we're trying to keep it focused. We've got 2 products and a third that's on the way. So, trying to integrate this into sort of daily social life and everything into the retail chain, which we're in the midst of right now. We have an oil form. You'll kind of like you take a CBD oil, which is called the Kava Plex oil, which is the one that you first tried and alluded to the most. You get 30 doses in one vial, or if you take higher dosages, of course, 2 full droppers full. If you take it in that, then you'll have 15 in there. And, that's a great all-purpose, really versatile oil. Even kids, we dose it with them. It's not overwhelming. Not that any kava is overwhelming, but you can get to a point where it's relaxing enough to it can be too much for someone all at once. Like you might want to relax instead of work, for example. So, this is really versatile. You can take it any time of the day. It leads to a good sleep later at night, but doesn't put you to sleep. So that's good. So, the second product are shots. You got the True Kava shots, which is essentially just like a 5-hour energy shot. But instead of that, it's a stress relieving sort of nootropic shot that's more kava in its traditional drink form. That's a little stronger, a little more on the euphoric side. And it's sort of that extra kick that you use on top of the Kava Plex oil if you want, or for any kind of social situation or just productivity situation. The third product is the same as the shot, but it's a carbonated beverage. And that's really sort of like the big product we're most excited about integrating into the culture. It comes in these 12-ounce cans. It's a carbonated drink. It tastes great. So you would share that just like you'd have a coffee with someone or have a beer with somebody.
When's that coming out?
That's coming out here sometime in the next couple of months. That's the one that we're integrating mainly into retail. But we're going to have an online sort of, subscription service too, where people can get it, because there's so much liquid. It's like, there's a lot of cost in shipping. We're going to do like a subscription service that people can get a hold of that before they're able to get it in their local retailer, which will be a bit. So that's kind of where we're going with that. We'll have some other products coming up down the pipeline as well too. That'll be food additive products and supplement products as well too. Everything that we're doing is 100% third-party lab tested. Some of the things that I sort of alluded to earlier, issues, a lot of people hear this issue if they Google Kava online with kava and liver toxicity. That is only with non-traditional kava products that are denatured through solvent extraction. All of that stuff is associated to what we consider not true kava. Well, not just what we consider, what the WHO and what regulatory agencies consider. There's 2 types of kava products. There's traditional kava, like I said, that's in the drink and oil form. That's food grade, that's certified to be food grade. And then there's like these sort of rogue extracts that use these solvents that sort of denature it and use the wrong parts of the plant that you're not supposed to consume a lot of times. That's what's associated with potential issues, not these traditional kava products. So much so that the WHO, we were involved in this, but the WHO has actually passed an international quality standard that has set this form of kava that we use as food grade. So it's classified as a food, not even as a supplement. So it's classified as a safe food for daily use, just like coffee. Just so people know, the most important thing whenever you're taking something is it safe? Before does it work? People want to know if it's safe. And any of these deleterious effects that you can read about are almost totally exclusively always associated with these non-traditional preparations. We use the traditional form.
That's really great information. And is there anyone that shouldn't be taking Kava?
Just like with anything else or any other powerful medicine, there's going to be a percentage of people that don't tolerate it well. Mm-hmm. Right. There's even like for example, there's like a 1 in, I think, 4 million likelihood of allergic skin reaction that can come from some of the compounds in Kava, which aren't really even in our Kava products because of the way we process them. And that's called derma. And you can get kind of like a thing that goes away as soon as you stop taking it. It's extremely rare, but it can happen. Today, people are sensitive to so many things. If you stack it with high doses of like acetaminophen and stuff, it can be hard for your body to process. But mainly those Kava extracts that I'm talking about that aren't real Kava, that's a problem. If you stack those with acetaminophen or things that hit the liver hard like alcohol. But even with ours, we've never seen that. But I just tell people to just not stack it with any of those things because your body has to process this still either way. If you can help it. There's really little to no serious counterindications besides just see how your body tolerates it. Any reaction that you could have that's extremely rare most likely will stop after you stop taking it if you're one of those very rare people that does happen. We can't necessarily recommend it because there aren't enough studies for like pregnant or nursing women, even though in the islands that's done regularly. We don't have no known counterindication, but you always talk with your doctor about that, even though they probably won't know anything about it. I mean, you definitely have to just make your own decisions on that kind of stuff that we don't have information on because we can't say like in those. But so those are the few cases there. But besides that, Kava is well tolerated by mass populations in its food form.
Yeah, Cameron, thank you. That's really helpful to know. I know there's a lot of information out there about Kava, and you were saying that one of the things that's most important to you, especially because you've talked to so many islanders and indigenous people who have used Kava for centuries and who have such respect and admiration for the plant, that you wanted to be one of the people and one of the businesses that really brought Kava back in terms of its credibility, its trustability here. And that comes through the process and how you're making it. And so you hold one of the highest standards. And like you said, the World Health Organization has set a standard. The bar that you've cleared has classified Kava as a food and is safe for daily use, which is, very good to hear for anyone who's considering taking this leap. So like you said, I'm going to be linking in the show notes the Kavaplex, which I know you could use any time of day. I've just been using that at night before sleep to enhance my deep sleep. And also the shots, which I've tried. And I like them. They're very gentle. And like you said, relaxing, focusing, mood boosting. And those both will be linked in the show notes. And is there anything else that you would want to either say, share, or point our people to?
I don't think so. I mean, you can go to trucava.com. You can get all the information there. We've done, several podcasts that you mentioned across the board. We do a lot of, media stuff and everything. And just go check it out. If you want to try it, see if it's right for you. Definitely works for a lot of people. And it's a great try for sure.
Hey, did you get something of value out of this podcast? If so, I'm going to ask you a favor. Would you be so amazing as to go over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and a review? Your ratings and reviews can show someone who's just discovered our podcast for the first time that we are worth listening to. And that way we can reach a wider audience. So please head over to Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating and review. You rock.